The following is a special presentation from Antietam Cable Television.
Every area in the county has its own history of ghost stories and legends that were handed down through the generations. Some were attempts to explain unusual phenomenon, while others were intended to amuse and frighten children around the fire at night. The tri-state area is rich in history and in myths and legends that are unique to this area alone. Each segment of this program will highlight an individual location or event as related by local residents and historians. We invite you to join us as we explore this unusual aspect of our local history. Before we begin telling our tales of ghost and haunted places, it may interest you to know parapsychologists' definition of such spectral phenomenon. What is a ghost? Why do they only haunt specific places? And for what reason? Do ghosts really exist? Or are they merely the product of man's creativity and imagination? Professor Gilbert Hall has lectured on these and other related topics for many years before widely diversified groups of people. Currently, he's teaching a course entitled Parapsychology, ESP, Ghost and Immortality at Hagerstown Junior College, and will now attempt to answer some of our questions.
Some years ago, when I was a member of the full-time teaching staff here, the college asked me to go out on their Speakers Bureau circuit and talk as a kind of a public relations, I guess you'd say, gimmick for the college, part of their recruiting policy. In casting about for a topic, I soon discovered that more people were interested in parapsychology and ghosts and related topics than almost any other subject. When the subject of ghosts is first raised, immediately there are several basic questions. One, what is a ghost? Where is the ghost? What am I really experiencing? How do I know I'm not drunk, I'm not hallucinating? Well, one of the jobs of parapsychology, as I understand it, is to provide some kind of an intelligible framework within which the ghost will make sense. And that's what we're going to try to do today.
In order to understand the theory behind the existence of spirits in our world, Professor Hall explains that you can't always believe your eyes.
One of the first kinds of questions one often gets when talking about ghosts is, where are these ghosts? Where is my dead Uncle Charlie? And the problem of accepting the validity of the phenomena often lies in the fact that most people in our kind of society, so-called modern scientific world, both professional academic type people and the so-called lay people, the reason they are reluctant, or one of the reasons they are reluctant to accept the validity of ghosts and similar kinds of phenomena is they just can't fit it into their, what they would consider their common sense view of reality. Now, I'd like to talk a little bit now about that so-called common sense view of reality and indicate that reality is not quite that common sense. As the chart here indicates, the so-called energy spectrum, that is the electromagnetic spectrum, which casts the energy onto our eye that enables us to see the so-called real common sense world, that in that energy spectrum, only a very small segment, this thin sliver that goes up here to the point of visible light, only that very small sliver is responded to by the human eye. Out to the right, we have the shorter wavelengths, so infrared, radio waves, and broadcast bands. Those are invisible to us. Out to the left, we have the higher frequencies, increasing as we go from right to left. Ultraviolet, X-rays, gamma rays, cosmic rays. The point, which is very clear as per the chart, is that almost all of physical reality is imperceptible to us. So you've got to remember that the so-called common sense world that everybody talks about is a very thin abstraction or a lifting out from the total reality. And actually that common sense world is a construction of the human mind based on very few cues. That's one point to keep in mind. So this should break down the barriers a little bit of the skepticism of the validity of the unseen, because almost everything is unseen. The view you get from spiritualists and Eastern philosophers and yogis and people such as that, who have their own kind of cosmology, their own kind of model reality, is that as we go from right to left on this diagram and you get increasing frequencies and wavelengths, that there are other worlds out here, worlds beyond worlds beyond worlds, as Walt Whitman used to say, you know, worlds within worlds within worlds. And these worlds are interpenetrating and are right here where we are.
Now the questions arise. What are these other worlds like? And if it is possible for individuals to return to this world, what draws them here?
To the question, where is Uncle Charlie? Probably the most probable answer you would get from people who are involved in this kind of thing, such as the spiritualists in the United States, they would refer to another world that interpenetrates the physical world. They would refer to it as the astral world or the astral plane. What is this astral world or astral plane? Well, in terms of our chart showing frequencies to which the human physical organism is insensitive, we would say it's a world of increasing frequencies beyond the frequencies which are available to the normal human being. So in this particular scheme of things, this astral world, which has 7 subdivisions, interpenetrates the physical world. In a sense, it's here and now, except that it's imperceptible. Now, Uncle Charlie, if he is the so-called normal, average, neither too good nor too bad human being, such as we all pretty much conceive ourselves to be, he would probably be about halfway up to number 4, perhaps. Now, in terms of ghosts and hauntings and related phenomena, the general consensus seems to be that most of the hauntings take place from people who are in, as should we say, trapped in level 1, 2, or 3. These planes are not particularly advanced, as shall we say, intellectually, emotionally, or spiritually. The people who, in a sense, are trapped down here and have not gone on to other planes as they're supposed to do, as we'll discuss in a minute, are usually people who, for one reason or another, are very powerfully attracted to the earth, to probably particular places and particular people on the earth. Well, why would they be attracted? Well, just as in ordinary life, we have people who are obsessed with certain ideas, certain kinds of behavior, certain places. And by obsessed, we mean they have an attraction, a concern that seems to be even more powerful than their conscious mind. They have very little control over it. So there are many beings, so-called dead beings, who are attracted to perhaps a house where some violence was done, a crime involving high levels of emotion, of hostility and revenge and so on and so forth. So emotions are very powerful on this astral plane. As you might well imagine, when a person is freed of the physical and the limitations of the physical, his mental life and his emotional life become all powerful. In ordinary earth life, the physical body is a great restrainer and a great limitation on just how wild our emotions and how far our thoughts can go. But these people are free to the physical, so if they have very strong feelings, very strong, either for or against certain people or certain places, they are almost magnetically, shall we say, attracted. And they come back time after time after time. And they come back because by the very nature of being out of the physical, they cannot really affect any particular change in material conditions. So they may try for years, perhaps centuries, to bring about some change in an event which has already taken place, undo the event. The murder was not committed. Or they may attempt to do or right some wrong they think they may have done on earth. They may feel that they have wronged someone, and they try to make up for it, as we say. But in most cases, they're not able to do this. So they're simply racked by guilt, racked by regret, and so they're, in a sense, programmed and attracted back. And so, as often is the case, the ghost seems to be in a very rigid behavioral pattern. That is, the ghost walks up the stairs every night at 11:30 for 300 years. Or a crime is enacted over and over and over again, year after year. So in a sense, there's no progress.
So it seems as if unfinished business and strong emotional attachments are at the heart of hauntings, at least according to the views held by parapsychologists. And that's precisely the theory behind the haunting of Hagerstown's Maryland Theater, which we will look into in depth next.
It could be said that one of the great traditions in England is the presence of ghosts. Haunted castles, haunted cathedrals, haunted theaters. It seems as if ghostly legends add an appealing air of mystery and magic to the surroundings. That's why it's really no surprise to find that such legends have carried over to the United States. In fact, Hagerstown's own historic Maryland Theater is in keeping with such traditions. Former executive director of the theater, Mike Harsh, will tell us about the legend of the ghost of the Maryland Theater.
One of the interesting things that I learned about the Maryland Theater when I started working here in late 1979 was that there were a number of stories about a ghost in the Maryland Theater. At various times, I would hear stories from people who either had worked here or who currently work here about a presence in the theater. Perhaps they heard whistling when no one was there, or they heard something rolling under the seats, or they felt a presence behind them or a cold draft, and when they turned around, there was no one there. After I was here for a while, I myself began to not only hear some of the stories, but I also occasionally began to think that I heard maybe there was a presence in the theater. After looking into it a bit more, I began to like to think about the spirit of the Maryland Theater, or the ghost of the Maryland Theater, as being a very protective one, a benevolent one that perhaps may have even saved the theater from destruction during the very big fire that destroyed the entire front of this building. Came right to the back of the theater where we're standing now, and then the fire stopped. And the theater itself, all its beauty, its history, was saved for all the rest of us for generations to come. If there is a spirit, it's probably one that is protective. I talked about this to a number of people, and one of the sons of one of the former managers of the Maryland Theater said that perhaps it was in fact his father, who was a manager here for many, many years, was forced into an early retirement and never really wanted to leave the place. And maybe this haunting was a way of him coming back and taking care of the theater.
George N. Payette managed the Maryland Theater through 3 decades, ranging from the 1930s until his retirement in the early 1960s. With determination and commitment, Mr. Payette saw the theater through its prosperous years as well as its periods of decline. We spoke with his daughter, Pat Grove.
My father, his name was George N. Payette, and he was the manager of the Maryland Theater from 1935 until 1962. My brother and sister and I really grew up at the Maryland Theater. We went to the movies many times, and we always had a special place to sit, about the 5th or 6th row back on the right-hand side. And when it was time for us to leave, my father always stood in the back on the right-hand side, and he coughed. And we knew then it was time to get up and leave so we could get a ride home. If there is a ghost at the Maryland Theater, it possibly could be my father, because he loved the theater so much. And he would be a good ghost, though, because he'd like to see that it's being taken care of.
In addition, there are a few other theories as to the identity.
Could have been a performer, could have been a jilted lover of a performer. I'm sure that in the 4 years I was here, there were several people who were jilted by people backstage. Could have been a body that was found in the wreckage of the front part of the lobby after the fire in 1973. There are a lot of theories and there's a lot of conjecture, and I think that it's a fascinating part of the history of any theater, including one as beautiful and full of history as this one.
When I came to the Maryland Theater shortly after I started working here, stories about the ghosts began to surface. They were told frequently, although they are very minimal, as you know by what Mike Harsh has told you. There are only a few ghost stories, and pretty much they all take the same vein. There are people whistling, cans rolling down the aisles, people, hearing people walking on the steps. Those are the kind of stories that we heard. I remember in particular one event that was conveyed to me by a gentleman, a young man who worked here at the Maryland Theater. He was a volunteer. As he was cleaning the theater one day, he decided that he was going to explore the little nooks and crannies that this building has quite a few of. And he started to climb up the ladder into the superstructure. As he was making his way up the ladder, he conveyed that he had felt someone pull on his leg. He immediately descended the ladder, made his way to the lobby, and conveyed his story to us who were in the lobby in a rather frightened voice.
I like the whistling stories too. Several times, different people and myself, I had heard late at night, which was really early in the morning after a show. Say a show would be over at 11 o'clock. By the time loadout was finished, it might be 2 a.m. By the time the crew was finished cleaning up, having their dinner, 3, 4 a.m., lock up the theater and hear very ethereal, melodic whistling throughout the halls of the Maryland Theater. I had a little fun with that once in a while too. Occasionally when we'd have an employee working in here late at night, I used to like to sneak out of my office, which is about 2 stories above us, and up on top of the balcony and whistle myself and see what kind of reaction I got. Usually the reaction was out the door of the theater. Another story that I used to like to tell people was a story of one of our employees who did maintenance work and cleaning work. We used to like to tell the story of the ghost a lot, and after telling it to people often enough, then they began to have their own ghost stories. This particular employee, early one morning when the box office manager came to work, she found him sitting out in the plaza on a brilliant sunlit day, and she thought he looked rather pale. And she said, "What's the matter?" And he said, "Well, I went in to clean the theater, and as I was getting ready to come into the auditorium part of the theater, I heard somebody coming down the steps." And he stopped, and he kept hearing the footsteps getting closer and closer and closer. And he turned and looked up the stairs, and of course no one was there. There's a great tradition in theater of ghosts. Probably the most famous one would be the Phantom of the Opera, which of course was a myth about a haunting, which in fact turned out to be an actor or performer who had been damaged physically in one way. Maybe that's why I always got a kick out of perpetuating the myth and sometimes adding to it myself. But we don't really know, and we do know that there have been many, many times when this theater was on the brink of disaster. And if it wouldn't have been, for instance, for the citizens to save the Maryland Theater back in the late 70s, and if it would not have been for the kindness and generosity of the people in the community during the 80s, the theater would have been badly damaged by fire, by neglect, by misuse, by rain, when the roof leaked very badly. I think there is a benevolent spirit here. And whether that spirit is a physical presence of somebody particular that had died in the past, or whether it's the collective spirits of all of us who have loved and enjoyed the Maryland Theater over the years since it first opened in 1915, regardless, that's a very real spirit and a very real presence. And it's fun to feel that here and fun to talk about.
When you're here at the Maryland Theater and you hear the stories of the ghost, being talked about by the volunteers, being conveyed from the volunteers to the patrons. After a while, you begin to wonder if maybe you won't be lucky enough to experience one of these. One evening I was working here very late. It was about 2 o'clock in the morning, and I was coming out of the office and I went past the balcony steps, and for a moment I thought I heard someone in the balcony whistling. I had a moment of fright, but I also decided that if it was a ghost, he was a benevolent ghost. He was here to watch over the Maryland Theater, and he was watching over me.
We're here in beautiful Williamsport, a small town with a big history. Bordering the town is the surging Potomac River and the copious C&O Canal with a history all its own. Did you know that this little town was almost selected to be the U.S. capital? There's something else that remains here that so few people know about. It's the legend and memory of a mysterious lady found many, many years ago to wander the dark streets, alleys, and cemeteries of Williamsport. Her memory has faded with an era when ghost tales were matter of fact, and those who didn't believe were very few. Listen to just a few of the local residents who explain their accounts of the days when the Veil Lady roamed the streets of Williamsport.
The legend was that they had a veil over their face and supposed to have been seen by various people, although I never saw it. I've heard it when I first moved around here. I was living on Vermont Street, which was back in 1923, 24. And as a child then going to school, people would, especially around Halloween, would say that the Veil Woman's out. And he was afraid to go up in the cemetery because it said she's up there behind some tombstone, they'd say. But I was around with some of them looking, but I never saw any place.
The legend of the Veil Lady in Williamsport has been around since I was a child. My father talked about her, my brothers talked about her, the old people in Williamsport talked about her. Some joked, and some was very serious about her. My experience with her, it was very serious because she was very weird looking. She was small frame, and she had all dressed in black. She wore a veil. I'm not sure about a hat. I don't know what the veil was attached to. But you could see a face, but her features weren't plain through the veil. I imagine that's why she wore the veil. She didn't want you to see who she was. But as I think about it, I relive it, and my heart's pounding now because she really was scary. My first Veil Lady was I was coming home from the movies in Williamsport, going home to Tannery Row, which is now known as Fenton Avenue, when I saw the shadow behind the big tree there. And as I started by, it moved and came out. And I went to the middle of the road, and she came toward me. So I turned and ran.
Up here at the corner of Church and Conococheague, one night somebody had supposed to have had something down over their head and grabbed these two girls, and they ran, and one fell and skinned her knee off, and they ran over there on the, I think, on Ed Shank's porch. And but I don't remember them saying who it was. He never saw who it was. They were too scared, I guess.
When I asked my father why a person or whatever would try to scare somebody like that, a child, he said that he thought maybe it was a woman or whatever trying to protect the children, to keep them home, not go out after dark. And since then, I think, as I got older and thought back, I agree, because really, she never tried to harm me in any way. She just was there, and I think maybe he was right. And I know that people in Williamsport think that it was a joke, and it was a man dressed like a woman, and maybe they're right too. But the person I saw was a woman, definitely a woman.
High atop the hill just outside of Fort Ritchie stands the estate known as Tipahato, an Indian word meaning top of the hill. The house and property are currently owned by Dr. Mary Jo Cannon, a specialist in emergency medicine at Washington County Hospital.
It's an interesting story. I came to hear about the house when I first came to Hagerstown, began work in the emergency room, and started to work with the retarded citizens. There's a movement to put retarded citizens in private homes, and they told me about a home on 491. I went to see a real estate agent and asked if I could see the home on 491. We never saw another house. We drove out here, and he had to find it. He didn't even know of the house at that time. I saw it. We got an appointment for that afternoon. It had been on the market for 2 years. I had the contract that night, and I had the house in 1 week, which to me is nothing short of a miracle, given that, as I say to people, in 1974, I was turned down for a central charge card, you know, and yes, I'm a medical doctor, and, you know, I had come to the area But I looked at this house and I said, I have such a sense about this place. I fell in love with it the first time I walked through, and it just seems more than a coincidence that things worked out so beautifully that my contract was accepted and that I had it in 1 week. Yeah. I have a tremendous sense that this is a very special place.
The house was built in 1902 by Catherine Taylor, the only daughter of a wealthy banker from Baltimore. Catherine fell in love with a musician, but her father refused to grant her permission to marry beneath her class.
When her father passed away and she came into her inheritance, she was yet a young woman. She came here, built this house, bought the land for as far as you can see from the royal family. And she had parties. She raced greyhounds. I like this lady. She went on safaris to Africa. She had parties. And people would come in at the train station in Cascade, which was Blue Ridge Summit at the time, and they'd come by carriage up the hill to the carriage port, which she had built out here. I had heard all of this before I moved in. I knew that she lived here until she died. I knew she was buried next door in the cemetery next to the stone church, but no one had ever said anything about hauntings. But I had been here for a couple of days, and I was coming down the front stairway with a friend when the front door opened and closed. And it was an exceptional experience. Both of us were, we stopped and we looked. There was no wind. There weren't drafts. It was it felt like a summer afternoon. It was late September. But the door just opened and closed. And that, to me, has been a major type of occurrences in terms of what happens in the house. But was, again, maybe a month after that I was watching a TV show with the same friend, sitting upstairs, and the knob on a door right across from us opened, and the door opened and closed. And that at a couple of other points in the next couple of hours, the door, each time we just smiled and looked at each other, And again, when I had been here during the first month, I had a tremendous sense of a presence in the room on this floor. That is to your right when you first come in, which I think of as a formal dining room type area. And I just had a very strong sense of there being a type of presence in there. I thought I saw someone walk into the room, so that's the only time, and it was such a strong impression of someone walking into the room. Just kind of glanced out the door and thought someone was walking into the room. I immediately surmised it was Linda and walked out and started talking to her. But she wasn't in the room, she was upstairs, so. At any rate, it wasn't long after I mentioned the door opening and closing, and people say, oh yes, it's haunted. Catherine died, everyone knows it's haunted, And I would hear from other people that and I also talked with the family who owned it before, who'd never mentioned anything in reference to hauntings, whose son had had a number of experiences similar to this, and he said, oh yes. As though, of course.
After so many unusual experiences at the house, a pattern of events developed.
In reference to whether or not we have the occurrences coming in clusters or at certain times of the year, I have been here now over a year, and I've found myself beginning to watch. When I recently had the house reappraised, there were a number of things in one day. And there will be long periods of time during which everything is quiet. I wondered whether we would have more experiences today because we would be talking, but I haven't as yet had any today. Although that one day I was very much aware because of doors opening and closing, and when a friend arrived and I'd been cleaning and getting the house ready for the appraisal, and I mentioned that this was the room where Catherine had died, that there had been so much movement about it, and she made a statement to me in reference to Catherine, and the door slammed on the room. And it was one of those times, there's been approximately 3 times when, while discussing Catherine, something occurs, an object will move, or as in this case, the door slammed shut because we looked at each other and she said, I don't think Catherine likes that.
It seems more than a coincidence that most of the occurrences revolve around the month of September.
It's the month that I bought the house, and I saw it in the same month. I mean, so, and then I had it reappraised in the same month. Maybe we'll find a pattern here.
After our discussion with Dr. Cannon, we visited the cemetery in which Catherine was buried. It's a known fact that when Catherine passed away, she was in the front bedroom of the house. And according to the stone marking her grave, she died in the month of September. We asked Dr. Cannon how she came to believe that it was the ghost of Catherine Taylor that was haunting her home.
That's my interpretation, although when I began to mention to people that the door opened and closed and that things moved or whatever, it seems that this is common knowledge among people who have lived here for a long time, that things happen in this house, and that is Catherine. It's interesting, though, that the very first time I was in the house and the door opened and closed and that I felt that sense of someone, I felt that it was Catherine.
And how does it feel to be haunted by the ghost of the previous owner of your house?
It's always been comfortable. There's never been anything frightening. Catherine has the spirit or the energy here, and I see that as Catherine has always been benevolent. I've always had good feelings about her, as well as everyone else who has had experiences here.
The question of belief in ghosts is as old as man's imagination and intelligence. Some feel that believing in the existence of the supernatural indicates an impressionable nature, while others feel it shows a sensitivity and openness to infinite possibilities. Do ghosts really exist? As for the estate of Tipahato, only Catherine Taylor holds the answer.
I have such a sense about this place.
Here, in the presence of sombered souls, lies Michael Zittle, a man that grew to palatial importance for the inhabitants of South Mountain. Did you know of his existence? There was a time when he was the most valued man for miles and miles. In fact, they say even the local physicians would consult him from time to time. There's been some documentation of the existence of Wizard Zittle. Doug Boss, the local historian, will recount that existence and some of those legends and superstitions that are so much a part of South Mountain in the little town of Boonesboro.
The Zittles came from Pennsylvania and moved into this area about 1800. And like a lot of the so-called Pennsylvania Dutch, their religion was somewhat mysterious. And pretty soon, Michael Zittle Jr. became known for his ability to bring about wondrous cures. And people were coming from all around, seeking his help and his advice, hoping to be cured. And many of them were very pleased and apparently felt that he could cure them. These cures were brought about from various charms, or you might say hex formulae, that were in an old German book in the possession of Zittle. Mrs. Dahlgren, who wrote about Zittle in 1882 in her book South Mountain Magic, felt that Wizard Zittle practiced black magic, that he was blasphemous. But actually, Zittle was a faith healer. These little charms were prayers to him. They were benedictions. And actually what he was doing was blessing the wound or blessing the illness. In Zittle's book, there's a charm for almost any problem that might arise. How to stop blood, that's a famous one. How to make a thief bring back stolen goods. Here's a handy one, how to stop bullets. A sure cure for the go-backs. That's the one that Wizard Zittle was most famous for, his ability to cure the go-backs. Today we would call go-backs the rickets. It's the apparent wasting away of a young child. Instead of growing, the child seems to be going in the opposite direction. Hence the name go-backs. The cure for the go-backs was always done with great secrecy. The priestess would lay the child out on a table, studying the child and then slowly spreading his arms out in the form of a cross. Then she would take 2 pieces of special string. The first piece she would use to measure the child across, from the fingertip to the fingertip, to see how wide he actually was. Then she would take the second piece of string, and she would measure from the tip of his head to the very tip of his toes. Then she would see what the difference was. This was the test to see whether the child really had go-backs, because if he measured more across the arm span than he did for the full height, that was a sure sign he had the go-backs. Then she would proceed with the cure. She would take the jug of special oil, and she would put it on her hands, and then taking the 2 thumbs, she would massage the body in a special way down the breastbone, all the while saying, "Abomin depart, Abomin depart, Abomin depart." Then she would take those 2 pieces of string, and the first piece she would wind around the hinge of the household doorway, and the second string around the lower hinge of the doorway. And then, as a normal opening and closing of the door, within a few days, those strings would be worn the whole way through. And when they were worn through, then the child was cured. That's if the charm really worked.
Ah, South Mountain. It's a wonderful place to be. At least these days, it's not as filled with superstitions and legends. Or is it? In Wizard Michael Zittle's day, he roused the uncertainty in the minds of those who made South Mountain their home. And down there, in Zittlestown, is not only the home of Wizard Michael Zittle, but it's also the byway from which travelers made their way over South Mountain and down the old forgotten logging road. And many legends have waxed in this little community and remain to be a part of its heritage. Doug Bost will once again convey his knowledge of one of those legends that remain in the minds of so few, but should be carried on to future generations.
In her book, South Mountain Magic, Madeline Dahlgren describes the people of Zittlestown and their beliefs, their superstitions. But I think the most intriguing legend she describes is the legend of the black dog, the snarly yowl, as she says. It was kind of a dog demon, and many of the people of Zittlestown talk about seeing the dog. And here we are at the homestead of Wizard Zittle, the original log cabin of Glendale. Now, Wizard Zittle didn't mention anything about the black dog, but I think it's very intriguing that right across from the front of his house, across the old road at the spring house, is where most people sighted the black dog. And this is the old spring house at Glendale. It was here that most folks said that they saw the black dog. Most of the descriptions were the same. They said the black dog suddenly came down the old mountain path here, went right by the old spring house, and then disappeared beyond in the mountains. And through the years, these descriptions were almost always the same.
The dog was black, bigger than the average dog, ferocious looking. Sometimes the dog seemed to get bigger and then get smaller. Sometimes the dog seemed to have white spots that flashed. There was one gentleman that lived here by the name of Luke, and he describes the dog. He said, I was coming from Boonesboro one evening. It was late at night. I was hurrying home. He said it was all spooky here in the gorge. And he said, all of a sudden, right in front of me appeared the black dog. Couldn't even get by it. He said it was in the road, and all of a sudden it got bigger. I tried to get around it, but he said I had a shaft with me as I was walking, and he said, I tried to hit the dog, and I slashed at it. And he said, that piece of wood just went right through the dog as if it weren't there. And he said, then all of a sudden, the dog disappeared. And this is the old path as it winds down through South Mountain. This same old path that the black dog followed, coming out here at Noah's Falls. And the stories say that the black dog often stopped right here in the little pool below Noah's Falls to have a drink of water. And Noah's Falls is just below the old National Pike. And it was here as the early travelers walked along the pike and as they drove the herds of cattle that they would often stop here to have a drink of water. And many are their tales about these travelers as they were stretched out here drinking the water, and they were scared to look up, but they heard the lapping of the black dog's tongue as the dog was refreshing itself. In fact, even today, a lot of the older folks reminisce about the tales of the black dog, talk about tales that their parents and different relatives have told them.
I was born in 1899, and my parents were married, I think, in 1892. And before that, of course, my father was courting my mother. And he lived in Frederick County, and she lived in Washington County, and he would ride horseback to visit her. And one time when he crossed the mountain at Dahlgren's, he saw the black dog. And he said that it looked like an ordinary dog to start with, but then it began to grow. And it seemed to stretch halfway across the road. And of course he yelled at it. And when he did, it went up in a puff of smoke. I've never seen the dog, of course. I hope I never do. But I've heard stories about it from different people, and I dare say any number of people saw it. They couldn't imagine a thing like that.
It's been many years now since anyone has seen the black dog. But most of the local residents say the black dog is still around. It's just that people are buzzing by too quickly in their automobiles. They don't have time to see the dog. So the next time you're coming down South Mountain on the old National Pike, slow down as you get near Noah's Falls. Look over here and see if you can see the black dog.
Ghosts and legends, whether real or imagined, are definitely a part of our lives and our history in Washington County. There are many other tales of hauntings and strange occurrences in this area. Some people swear to their authenticity, while others merely enjoy them as entertaining stories. But one thing is for certain, young and old alike, whether they believe or not, are fascinated by the realm of the unknown. And what about you? Do you believe in ghosts? The next time you hear that creaking on the stairs, will you explain it away through reason? Or will a little nagging doubt of what it could be cause you to take a second glance? If you do, look closely. You may be surprised at what you see, or what you don't.